take a listen to something that Bob Dylan had to say about George Harrison here. He actually makes two separate points, and I'm going to push back against one of them after we listen to the clip. I'm going to ask you for your input on both. So let's listen in here to what Bob Dylan had to say.
George got stuck, with being the Beatle that had to fight to get songs on records because of Lennon and McCartney. Well, who wouldn't get stuck? I mean, if George had his own group and was writing his own songs back then, he'd have been probably just as big as anybody. Yeah, he was from that old line of playing where every note was a note to be counted.
So what Dylan's saying there is that George Harrison was probably a good enough songwriter and performer that he could have been a solo artist even without the Beatles. And this sets up a question, which is, was George Harrison actually kind of like a suppressed solo artist trapped inside the Beatles? Or was he something different than that, something that's maybe even a little bit harder to define? Bob Dylan clearly admires George Harrison and has called him one of the greatest guitarists in history. And if you listen to that clip, he said there that George was from the tradition where you made every note count. And that is very high praise coming from Bob Dylan, who always values intent over flash. Dylan's logic makes a lot of sense. George Harrison wrote something, "Here Comes the Sun," "While My Guitar Gently Weeps." He sang with authority, and he could absolutely front a record, and did. So on paper, yes, George Harrison could have been a solo artist without the Beatles. But here's where I see it differently. George Harrison wasn't wired like a solo artist. He wasn't wired like a band leader. He was kind of like the quintessential band member. He thrived in conversation, and he plays the guitar in a way that helps shapes songs. His solos are rarely about speed or volume, but they're about placement, tone, and emotional timing. And a lot of times they are responses to someone else's melody, someone else's lyrics, someone else's song idea. George played like someone who knew exactly when not to play. And he left room for Lennon's edge and McCartney's melody and Ringo's feel. Even his slide guitar later on was more expressive than it was busy. So he didn't think in terms of me, and he didn't fill up a lot of space. And I'm not saying that's a limitation, I'm saying that's his philosophy. We often measure greatness by how well someone stands alone, but George Harrison reminds us that there's another kind of greatness, which is being the musician who elevates everyone else. The one who doesn't need spotlight, one whose restraint becomes their signature. And this is how I see George Harrison. And as far as him being one of the greatest guitarists because he knew exactly how to make every note count, I agree with that assessment completely. And I think that his ability to make every note count is part of his status as the quintessential band member. So what I'm saying here has to be kind of carefully parked. It's not that I'm saying he couldn't have been successful. I'm saying that it would have been a waste of his true talent, which was to be a member of a great band. And it's that talent, to be a great group participant and co-creator, that helped take the Beatles to that next level. Now, when it comes to George Harrison's songwriting, there's absolutely no doubt that he had a lot of chops. The one question that I would put forward in this regard is whether or not he wrote enough songs to carry a band. So if you look at Lennon and McCartney, they just wrote hundreds of songs. George Harrison's output was rather sparse. Now I know that Lennon and McCartney were not actively pursuing Harrison's songs, but I still have always had the feeling that he was kind of a slow, methodical songwriter. Not nearly as prolific as other songwriters. And the music industry, if you're going to be the center of a band or have a band where you're the primary creative force, you have to come up with a lot of material. You have to do it regularly. And Harrison seems to me as someone who was sometimes volcanically creative and other times dormant and quiet. So I think that this is another factor that makes him kind of the ultimate band member, where he could take the spotlight now and again, but just as comfortable in a side role. So I think that this also factors into whether or not Bob Dylan's observations are really accurate. So now I hear from you. Drop your thoughts in the comments below.
MusicGuru here, asking you to help us on our march to 10,000 subscribers.